Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be tackling a region that I think is often misunderstood. It's Papua,
Okay.
specifically Western New Guinea,
Mm-hmm.
the Indonesian provinces of Papua and West Papua.
Right.
And, you know, you've given us a really interesting mix of sources for this one.
Yes.
We have historical analysis, human rights reports,
Yes.
even some anthropological studies.
Yeah, good mix.
Which is perfect because, you know, we really want to get that 360 view of a complex situation.
Absolutely. And it's a region that I think deserves that kind of attention.
Totally. So our mission today, if you will, is to uncover how this label of Stone Age has been used to justify control over Papua and look into how Papuans have fought for self-determination. And you know how even today the legacies of colonialism and slavery are still playing out there.
Yeah, it's a long history.
So to get our bearings straight, can you just tell us where exactly on the map are we talking about?
Sure. So Papua makes up the western half of the island of New Guinea, right next to the independent nation of Papua New Guinea.
Got it.
And this western half, formerly known as Western New Guinea, it has a long history of Dutch colonization. But things get really interesting and controversial.
Okay.
In 1969, with the transfer to Indonesian control,
Okay.
through something called the Act of Free Choice.
Act of free choice. All right, well, we'll definitely unpack that a little bit later.
Yeah, we'll have to.
But first, something from Danilyn Rutherford's book, Living in the Stone Age, really stood out to me.
Okay.
She talks about this persistent narrative of Papuans being backward primitive.
Right.
It's almost like they're stuck in a time warp.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds romantic in a way, you know, like this noble, savage idea. But I imagine it's more insidious than that.
It is. It's really used to infantilize these indigenous populations and justify intervention as if they need outside forces to kind of guide them into modernity.
Yeah.
And Rutherford highlights this quote about Papuans having poor human resources.
Oh, wow.
Which is really loaded language that reinforces this idea of them needing help, needing to be civilized.
So it's not just a casual observation.
Right.
It's setting the stage for control.
Exactly. And this perception was further solidified in the 1930s, when Dutch officials arrived with this express goal of civilizing the indigenous population, entering a world they saw as ripe for transformation.
It's like those old adventure stories where explorers set off to tame the wild unknown.
Right.
Except the unknown is already someone else's home.
Exactly.
But here's where it gets even more layered. Rutherford argues that sympathy itself was a tool of control in Dutch colonialism. Did you find that surprising?
It's a very complex dynamic.
Yeah.
You have, on the one hand, these Dutch officials in the 1930s trying to understand Papuan customs and beliefs.
Right.
They wanted to put themselves in Papuan shoes, but it wasn't necessarily out of genuine respect. It was more a way to more effectively govern.
So it's almost like, I need to understand your motivations so I can predict your actions and ultimately control them.
Right.
It's clever, but deeply manipulative.
Exactly. And this wasn't just about personal interactions.
Okay.
Technology also played a key role. Rutherford highlights figures like Jan van Eschede, often called the father of the Papuans, who led expeditions into the Papuan interior, and he relied heavily on native guides and bearers.
Oh, interesting.
He needed that local expertise to survive.
So here's this Dutch official, the representative of colonial power.
Yeah.
But he's dependent on indigenous knowledge for his success.
Yes.
It really flips the script on that whole colonizer is superior narrative, doesn't it?
It does, and that tension between understanding and control, the colonizer needing to both learn from and dominate the colonized, it's a recurring theme throughout colonial history.
It's a reminder that power dynamics are rarely straightforward.
Right.
And this leads us perfectly into the Papuan struggle for self-determination. Yeah. Which is where things get really inspiring, though of course not without their share of tragedy.
Of course.
We have this document simply titled Koreri, 1972, which describes this fascinating movement, blending indigenous beliefs with Christian elements.
It's very interesting.
It seems to embody this deep desire for autonomy to be free from outside control.
The Koreri movement is key to understanding Papuan aspirations. It's not about rejecting everything foreign, but about reclaiming control over their destiny, their land, their future. It's been adapting for centuries, taking different forms, but that core message of self-determination has remained a constant.
The source mentions figures like Wilhelmus Rumbewas and Anganitha from the early 20th century who were involved in the movement.
Yeah, and it continues to inspire Papuan independence movements today.
Speaking of which, we have the powerful words of Philip Karma.
Yes.
From Sikan Kidoang Sitenga Binatang.
Yes, very powerful.
Where he says he refuses to die foolishly.
Wow.
And chooses to be a martyr for the cause. He was imprisoned for his activism and died in 2022 while still under city arrest.
Yes.
His story really highlights both the hope and the cost of fighting for what you believe in.
Karma dedicated his life to advocating for Papuan rights, enduring hardship, and ultimately paying the ultimate price.
Wow.
It's a stark reminder that this fight for self-determination comes at a great personal cost for many.
Yeah, and it's a fight that's far from over.
It's true.
It's important to remember that the Papuan independence movement isn't a single entity.
No, it's not.
There are internal divisions and challenges, aren't there?
Yes, there are.
What are some of those?
Well, there are differing views on the best strategy for achieving independence. Some advocate for peaceful resistance, while others believe armed struggle is necessary.
Oh, wow. So that's a big...
Obviously, this creates tension and makes it difficult to present a united front. And then you have the influence of Indonesian government policies, like special autonomy, which we'll discuss in detail later. But it's created a divide between those who see it as a path to greater autonomy and those who believe it's just a way for Indonesia to maintain control.
Gotcha. So more division.
Yes. And then you have the impact of migration. The growing non-indigenous population in Papua adds another layer of complexity.
Right. Because then who are the Papuans then?
It raises questions about who gets to define Papuan identity and who has a legitimate claim to self-determination in this increasingly diverse region.
So with all these challenges, what's the current state of human rights in Papua?
Right.
The Human Rights Papua 2021 report doesn't paint a very hopeful picture.
It doesn't. The Indonesian government has labeled Papuan rebels as terrorists.
Oh, wow.
Essentially giving them a free pass to crack down on any dissent.
Yeah.
The report documents cases of torture killings and arbitrary arrests by Indonesian security forces.
That's awful.
It suggests a pattern of systematic abuse and impunity.
It's disturbing, to say the least. And it's not just about violence.
No.
The report also points to limited access to healthcare and education.
Yeah.
The marginalization that indigenous Papuans face in their own land.
Absolutely. It's like they're being denied their basic human rights.
And we can't forget about the internal displacement of Papuans due to the conflict.
Yes, a consequence of this militarized environment.
Yeah.
And this displacement connects back to what we were talking about earlier, the legacy of colonialism and its impact on who ends up where.
Right.
This cycle of displacement is a recurring theme in Papua's history, a constant uprooting from their ancestral lands.
And it's a trauma that echoes through generations.
Definitely.
So in response to all this, the Indonesian government implemented special autonomy back in 2002 to address these grievances.
Right.
But did it work?
That's a complicated question.
Yeah.
And Indonesia's failure in Papua by Amir Sharula gives us a good starting point. Special autonomy promised things like increased funding for development and recognition of Papuan culture.
Right.
But the reality has been very different.
What went wrong?
Corruption is a major factor.
Well,
instead of helping ordinary Papuans, a lot of that development funding ended up in the pockets of elites.
Oh, no.
In both Papua and Jakarta, a classic case of elite capture.
It's a pattern we see over and over again in history.
Sadly.
Power tends to protect itself.
Yes.
And, of course, the human rights abuses continued.
They did.
Despite the promises of special economy.
Right. So now there's this huge debate within Papua about whether to extend it or push for a referendum on independence.
It's almost like special autonomy has become this symbol for a much larger question.
Yeah.
Can Papua ever truly achieve self-determination within Indonesia?
Exactly. And that question leads us to the role of external actors, particularly the United Nations.
The UN often steps in as the defender of human rights and self-determination. But in Papua, its record is, well, let's just say it's complicated.
It is The United Nations and the Indonesian Takeover of West Papua by John Saltford.
Okay.
Is a must-read on this topic.
Right.
He explains how the UN facilitated the transfer of West Papua from Dutch to Indonesian control.
Wow.
Despite concerns about the legitimacy of that act of free choice.
So the UN, in a way, legitimized a process that many saw as flawed from the very beginning.
Yes, and in the decades since, their role in monitoring human rights and promoting self-determination in Papua has been incredibly limited.
Oh, wow.
It's a pattern we see all too often. Yeah. International bodies failing to protect the rights of indigenous populations, facing colonization or oppression.
It's a betrayal of the very principles the UN was founded on.
It is.
We've talked about colonialism, self-determination, human rights abuses. Right. But there's another layer to this story.
Okay.
A dark chapter that's not as widely known. Our source, Papuans Within Slavery, Slavery Within Papuans, reveals the long history of slavery in the region.
It's a crucial part of understanding Papua's past and present.
Wow.
Papuans were raided and traded as slaves by neighboring groups and European powers for centuries. Centuries. Imagine the centuries of being dehumanized and exploited.
What allowed this to go on for so long?
The source points to geography.
Okay.
Papua's remote location and the perception of Papuans as primitive made them easy targets.
Yeah.
For slavers, it was a combination of physical isolation and cultural prejudice that created this environment of vulnerability.
And what are the lasting impacts of this history? What do you think our listeners should take away from this?
It's multifaceted displacement is one.
Okay.
The forced removal of people from their communities, creating a sense of rootlessness, a disconnect from one's ancestral land.
Right.
Then there's the fear, the trauma that lingers long after the physical chains are broken, and a deep-seated mistrust of outside authorities.
Yeah.
It's understandable given that history of exploitation and betrayal.
Right. This legacy continues to shape how Papuans interact with the Indonesian government, with the UN, with any external power.
So you're saying this history of slavery is still present in how Papuans see the world?
Exactly.
How they engage with power structures.
Yes.
It's not just a chapter in a history book.
It's not. And unfortunately, Indonesia's current approach to security in Papua seems to be perpetuating this cycle of mistrust and fear.
You're talking about the implication of security approach towards human rights violations in Papua.
Right. This source explains how Indonesia has taken a security-focused approach to dealing with dissent in the region, prioritizing military solutions over addressing the root causes of the conflict.
Which is, sadly, a common response from governments dealing with any kind of separatist movements.
Right.
But as this source points out, it often ends up making things worse.
It does.
And this source gives specific examples of human rights abuses committed by Indonesian military personnel, torture killings, arbitrary arrests.
It's a long list. It's hard to even read about, to be honest.
It is a grim reality. Yeah. And the consequences of this security-first approach are devastating, creating an environment of fear and repression. It hinders any real attempt at finding a peaceful resolution.
Yeah.
Further fueling resentment and pushing people away from the Indonesian state.
We've covered a lot of ground already, but it feels like we're just scratching the surface.
We are. Papua's story is complex.
Yeah.
There are no easy answers, but the first step is understanding the historical and contemporary dynamics at play.
Definitely.
And it's important to remember that these aren't just abstract concepts we're discussing.
Right.
They have real-world consequences for the people of Papua.
That's what I keep coming back to. What does this all mean for the everyday lives of Papuans?
It means living with the constant presence of military and police forces. The fear of being arbitrarily detained or worse.
Yeah.
It means limited access to basic services like healthcare and education. It means seeing their land exploited for resources with little benefit to their communities.
It's a heavy burden to carry.
It is.
And yet there's this resilience that shines through in all these sources.
Yes.
A determination to preserve their culture, their identity, their right to self-determination.
Absolutely.
It makes you wonder, though, is the world even paying attention to what's happening in Papua?
That's a question worth asking.
Yeah.
We've talked about the UN's failures, but what about other countries or organizations?
Yeah.
Could they play a role in advocating for Papuan rights?
The tough situation.
It is.
Indonesia is a powerful nation with a lot of influence in the region. And it's not easy for other countries to challenge their sovereignty.
Right.
Especially when it comes to internal matters like Papua.
Yeah.
There's this difficult balance to strike between respecting national sovereignty and upholding human rights.
It's a dilemma the international community often faces.
But it's not impossible to make a difference. Our source, West Papua, Indonesia's last regional conflict, mentions that the United Liberation Movement for West Papua declared a provisional government in 2020.
Oh, wow.
That seems like a pretty significant move.
It is. It shows that the movement for independence is still active and evolving.
Yeah.
It also raises the question of whether other countries might be willing to recognize this provisional government.
Oh, interesting.
Which would be a major challenge to Indonesia's authority.
That would be a bold step, for sure.
It would.
And likely to face strong opposition.
Likely.
But it does highlight that the situation in Papua is not static.
No.
There's potential for change, whether it's greater autonomy within Indonesia or a push toward full independence.
We're at a crossroads, and the choices made in the coming years will have a profound impact on the future of Papua and its people.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from all of this?
I think it's this. Papua's story is not a simple one. It's a tapestry woven from threads of colonialism, self-determination, human rights abuses, and this deep-seated desire for justice.
Wow. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It's a story that deserves our attention, our empathy, and our commitment to learning from the past to create a better future.
You know, reading through all this, there was something that really stuck with me.
Okay.
From violations of human rights in the Timika area, Irian, Jaya, Indonesia. It's a report from 1995, so a while back.
Great.
But it emphasizes something so crucial.
What's that?
It's about listening to the voices of Papuans themselves.
Yes.
It's their story to tell their future, to shape.
Right.
We can read all the reports and analyses in the world, but ultimately it's about amplifying the voices of those directly impacted by this situation.
I couldn't agree more. It's about centering their experiences, respecting their agency, and supporting their right to determine their own destiny.
And that's something we should all be working towards.
Yes.
Not just in Papua,
Right.
but in any situation where power imbalances and historical injustices threaten marginalized communities.
Absolutely.
So as we conclude this deep dive into Papua, I'm left with this question.
Okay.
We've explored the past, we've analyzed the present.
Yeah.
But what does a truly just and sustainable future look like for Papua?
It's a big question, I know.
It is, but it's one we have to grapple with.
We do.
Given this long history of outside control and exploitation, what would it look like for Papuans to have genuine agency, for their rights to be respected, for their voices to be heard?
Yes.
What would that future actually look like?
It's a challenging question, but I think it starts with acknowledging the harm that's been done.
You mean confronting the legacy of colonialism, the violence, the dispossession?
Yes.
Really coming to terms with it all?
Exactly. There needs to be a process of truth and reconciliation.
Okay.
A reckoning with the past that allows for healing and accountability.
That seems like a very tall order, especially given the power dynamics we've been talking about.
It is, but there are examples from around the world, like South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that show it's possible to confront a painful past in a way that paves the way for a more just future.
And what about self-determination?
Yeah.
We've talked about the push for independence.
Right.
But are there other models that might be explored?
It's a crucial question. Perhaps it's a form of autonomy within Indonesia that gives Papuans control over their land resources and political destiny. Or perhaps it is full independence, allowing them to chart their own course as a sovereign nation.
Right.
But whatever that path forward looks like, it has to be chosen by Papuans themselves.
Yeah.
It can't be imposed from the outside.
That's the whole point of self-determination, right?
Exactly.
It means they have the right to freely decide their own political status and pursue their economic, social, and cultural development.
Right.
So that means creating spaces for dialogue, for conversations that include a diversity of Papuan voices.
Absolutely.
And ensuring those conversations are free from coercion or intimidation.
It's about creating an environment where Papuans can safely express their aspirations without fear.
It all comes down to trust, doesn't it?
It does.
Rebuilding the trust that's been broken by decades of broken promises and oppression.
Trust is essential, but it has to be earned through concrete actions, not just words.
Actions like respecting human rights.
Yes.
Demilitarizing the region.
Right.
And ensuring equitable economic development that benefits Papuan communities.
Those are all crucial steps. And it also means addressing the underlying issues of racism and discrimination that have fueled so much of the conflict.
So it's about dismantling the structures of power that have kept Papuans marginalized for so long.
It's about recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every Papuan individual and respecting their right to live in peace, security, and self-determination.
It's a vision worth fighting for.
It is.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
And it's been, honestly, quite a heavy journey.
It has, but it's important to remember that even in the face of immense challenges, there's always hope.
Hope for a future where Papua is no longer defined by conflict and oppression, but by peace, justice, and self-determination.
That's a future worth striving for.
And to you listening, we encourage you to keep exploring this issue.
Yes.
To seek out the voices of Papuans themselves.
Absolutely.
And to engage in meaningful conversations about how we can all contribute to a better future for this remarkable region and its resilient people.
It's a worthy cause.
One of the things that stood out to me when looking through this material
is
how often Western narratives focus on what they perceive as lacking in Papuan society.
It's true. We've discussed the Stone Age label, but it goes beyond that.
Yeah.
There's this tendency to view Papua through a deficit lens.
Right.
Focusing on what it needs to be fixed or developed, rather than recognizing its existing strengths and cultural richness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So much of the conversation centers around bringing Papua up to speed with the rest of the world.
Right.
But what if we flipped that perspective?
Interesting.
What if we asked, what can the world learn from Papua?
That's such an important question.
Yeah.
Papuan societies have a deep understanding of their environment, sustainable practices that have allowed them to thrive for centuries. They have rich traditions of community art and spirituality that offer valuable insights into alternative ways of being in the world.
It's like we're so focused on imposing our own ideas of progress that we miss out on the wisdom and knowledge that's already there.
And that brings us back to the importance of centering Papuan voices in this conversation.
Right.
It's not about outsiders dictating what development should look like, but about supporting Papuans in defining their own future on their own terms.
And that future might look very different from what we might expect.
It might.
It might challenge our assumptions about what constitutes progress or success.
Yeah.
It might force us to reevaluate our own relationship with the environment, with each other, with different ways of knowing and being.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Embracing that discomfort, that challenge to our preconceived notions, is how we grow and evolve as individuals and as a global community.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Papua's story is far from over.
It's not.
It's a story that continues to unfold, full of challenges and complexities, but also brimming with hope and resilience.
And it's a story that demands our attention, our empathy, and our willingness to listen and learn.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Papua. We hope it sparked your curiosity.
Yes.
And inspired you to learn more about this remarkable region and its people.
And it's important to remember, these aren't just abstract concepts we're discussing.
Right.
They have real-world consequences for the people of Papua.